there, and welcome to another Health Essentials podcast. I'm John Horton, your host. If you have multiple children, you've probably already noticed differences in their personalities. The explanation behind that might be as easy as counting 1, 2, 3. That's because many believe birth order, whether a child is the oldest, youngest, or somewhere in the middle, sets the stage for kids to develop certain traits. Today we're joined by pediatric psychologist Kate Eshleman to take a closer look at birth order theories. Dr. Eshleman is one of the many experts at Cleveland Clinic who popped into our weekly podcast to teach us more about our families and ourselves. So with that, let's see whether children are fated to act a certain way by the order of their appearance. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Eshleman. Thanks for stopping by Podcast Central to chat.
Great. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So I've really been looking forward to today's conversation, if only to settle a few debates with my younger brother. I'm guessing, though, we're not alone in some sibling banter over what birth order means.
Yes, I think many people like to think that they fit, at least with the positive attributes of the descriptions of birth order.
Exactly. Yeah, I know there's no shortage of theories and research regarding birth order's effect on personality. So as we get started here, can you explain just the general concept and give us some background as to where this all started?
Sure. So the general concept of kind of birth order theory is that where in the family the child is born really is going to predict or determine what their personality style is like. And where this information came from, a long time ago, there was a psychoanalyst, Alfred Adler, who described birth order and the attributes assigned to each of those placements in the sibling lineup.
Yeah, it's so unique because I know everybody has this. If you have siblings, you have these little things going back and forth. You can see where that just kind of develops.
Mm-hmm.
In looking at birth order theory and how it may influence people, it only seems right to start with the first kid. So let's talk about the signs and characteristics of oldest child syndrome.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times the oldest child is described really, again, in those primarily positive attributes, bright and intelligent, a leader, very conscientious, maybe perfectionist, sometimes a little bossy, but really kind of a leader, a bright person, someone who's probably going to be successful.
I like the way that all sounds because that's me. So now with those sort of traits, are those things that just kind of you see when the firstborn is young, or is that something that kind of carries through life?
I think it can be both. And so a lot of times you do see those personality traits start to develop, but in general, personality can vary over time. And it depends a lot on life experiences and what that person goes through.
Well, so we hit the oldest child. Let's go to the opposite end of the age spectrum. And can you give us some insight about being the youngest child and what that might mean?
Sure. So a lot of times the young child, which again, generally positive, but can be described as kind of very social, outgoing, a little more fun-loving and maybe cares a little bit less about performance and some of those perfectionistic tendencies. Maybe sometimes some attention seeking, but generally positive, fun, and outgoing.
Yeah. Now, are there, when you think about these traits, is this something that just kind of, I think it's just not happening because of the order you arrive. It's kind of what's happening in the household around you and just all the dynamics taking place with more people.
That's exactly right. I think there's a lot of things that contribute to our personality development and maintenance over time. And some of that is what we're born with, kind of that genetic piece and temperament style, and the events, kind of specific events, but also how kids are parented and how much time and energy and what's going on in the parents' lives as well.
Well, and that's always what comes up. I have 3 children, and I have to say, I hear from my oldest all the time that we were so much easier on the youngest. And, which is one of those things that kind of maybe goes into building these theories as to why people are a certain way.
That's right. When we think about parents and they have their first children, parents are more anxious. They want to do things right. They probably inherently have more time on their hands to focus on the first child. They're younger by nature too. So there's a lot of things that are happening when a first child is born versus when any subsequent children are born.
My oldest, my daughter was always convinced that we just had way too much time to spend on her. And by the time we had our last kid, it was just like, yeah, do whatever you want, man.
Uh-huh.
So we're tired. We're done with this. Just, and that would be why he's so carefree.
That's right. Well, you also learn over time, right, that they're not breakable, right? All that kind of parental anxiety that's present up front, and you focus on the child, and then you'll start to learn they fall down, they get back up. They spend the night at friend's house, things are okay. They're not quite as fragile as we maybe thought, and maybe they don't need as much care, which changes our parenting style as well.
It definitely does. I mean, you're always so worried with those first ones. And you're right. By the last one, you're like, it hit the floor. You can eat it.
But then as it turns out, those are maybe the ones we should worry about more then.
So we've talked about the oldest and the youngest, which always seems to be the ones that get the most attention. I don't want to forget the middle child. And I know that's always the belief that they're kind of forgotten. What do we know kind of about the traits associated with them?
Sure. Oftentimes, the middle child is kind of described as the moderator, the kind of the peacekeeper, the go-between, more independent, maybe because they feel like they have to be, but kind of the go-between, a little bit, again, go with the flow, a little bit of an easier temperament style, maybe sometimes has to seek their own attention because they're feeling like they're not getting it themselves.
Yeah, they also have a reputation for being a little more competitive too, right? I'd imagine that's because you're just always trying to catch up to that older sibling.
That's right. And you have to, one might feel that they have to compete for that attention, right? But not only competing with the older, so as you described, living up to, but then also there's a younger one. So there's always somebody that you have to be compared to.
You're trying to catch the one that's ahead of you and trying to keep the one that's behind you in their spot.
Behind you, yeah.
Oh, man. So, all right, so let's say you have no siblings. So if you're an only child, are you typically like a combination of all these traits we've kind of talked about, or do you kind of lean more one way or the other?
I think ultimately you end up having some of the attributes of any of the children, but oftentimes much more like that oldest child, probably described as more mature, bright, having some leadership abilities, kind of more conscientious and maybe perfectionistic. So I think those are many of the attributes attributed to the only child, but also can be kind of, competitive with others, having to seek attention at times. So probably a combination of both or all.
Yeah. Now, so when we say this, I know we talked about with the oldest child, but with all of them, like these traits, do they kind of set in motion just a way you're going to behave kind of throughout life and into adulthood and all of that, and just kind of get you on a course?
It's a complicated answer. And so the answer is both yes and no, right? Because you develop these personality styles, which can change over time, but also how our personality shines through and how we interact with others also determines how others interact with us. And so if we kind of have this natural interaction style, people are going to tend to respond to that, which also helps maintain it. But overall, personality style can shift and change over time.
All right. So now that we've gone over these stereotypes and which are always fun to talk about and the source of a lot of debate, let's get to kind of the big question. Are birth order theories true, or is this something that just kind of spices up the conversation at family dinners?
And it is funny, and it's a great conversation, right? Because there's this idea of confirmation bias. So when we look at our own families, you could say, oh, the oldest, that totally fits, right? Or at least parts of it do, because it makes sense. But if we step back and look at the literature, ultimately, there is nothing to determine that these are entirely accurate. Some aspects are likely true, but in most recent studies, when differences have been found, they've been kind of minimal or non-significant. So there's really nothing behind, or at least no hard evidence behind that these are entirely true.
Well, and you can see it. It sounds like this is very similar to maybe horoscopes or things like that, where you read it and you always kind of find there's a kernel of truth that you want to hang on to, but it's more just kind of for fun conversation and just to settle some family arguments.
That's right. Absolutely.
Early on, we had talked about how some of these ideas are kind of created because of how parents parent. So are there things that you can do with your kids to kind of avoid some of these stereotypes blossoming?
I think, and I always say everything we talk about is much easier said than done, right? But the goal is to parent the child that you have. So while kids are not, or people aren't necessarily born with personalities, we are born with temperaments that start from an early age. And you can see that even in infancy, right? And so each child is going to have a temperament style as they get older. And so ideally, you're parenting the child they have and responding to his or her needs. And we look at opportunities. Certainly, every opportunity for every child, even within a family, isn't going to be the same. But the goal would be to give, the children similar opportunities to kind of avoid any of those stereotypes or that sibling rivalry. Well, he got to do this or she didn't have to do that, right? We try and parent them the same.
Well, and that is what's hard. And I know looking at raising our kids here, you realize they had different lifestyles to a certain point because of where my wife and I were in our lives and what you have as far as financial resources or how your jobs are or things like that. So just the world's always changing. So how you parent changes. You almost wonder if some of these theories came up as a way to explain away that or just make people feel better about what they were doing.
Sure. Well, I also think looking back in the early 1900s when these theories were described, lives were not as long. Women weren't working. Education was different. Lots of things were different when this first started being talked about. And perhaps at least at the time, it made a lot more sense. But just as you described, things are very different now. And I even think about, a really concrete example would be the impact of the pandemic, which was a totally external event, had nothing to do with parenting, but experiences that kids had at different ages or, that were born during that time and the impact that would have on those children's experiences and temperament style and personality. I just think that's a great example.
Yeah, that is. And I have a feeling in 10 years, we're going to be doing a podcast looking back on what the pandemic did to everybody and how the ripple effect of that. So
absolutely.
So I'd say birth order is just, it's a fascinating topic. And this has been just a great discussion. And I'm sure it's answered a lot of questions people have on this whole topic. So is there anything else you'd like to add, I guess, before we say goodbye?
No, I think, again, just love those kids up and parent the kids that you have. And if you take the pieces that are helpful and leave the rest behind.
Great advice. So thank you so much for coming in, Dr. Eshleman, and look forward to having you back on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Birth order theory is certainly fun to talk about, but don't put too much stock in how it shapes personality. Consider it one small piece in the giant puzzle explaining why people act a certain way. And apologies if I come across as being a bit pushy on that explanation. I am a firstborn after all. If you liked what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Till next time, be well.